This is a special live stream edition, our very first, and we're digging into one of the most significant and controversial climate policy shifts in recent memory. We're talking about the Trump's administration's newly passed big, beautiful bill. Uh, I think it's got a truth in labeling issue, but on paper, it promises economic growth and energy independence. But when you dig deeper, it's clear this bill could fundamentally alter America's climate trajectory, affecting everything from clean energy investment to environmental protections and communities most impacted by pollution. To unpack this, we've assembled a powerhouse panel. First, Dr. Gernot Wagner, a climate economist at Columbia Business School, also faculty director of Climate Knowledge Initiative, and author of 6 books, including Climate Shock and Geoengineering, The Gamble. And Dr. Wagner's research focuses on the risks, technologies, and policies shaping climate future. Next, we have Lucero Marquez, Associate Director of Federal Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress. She's a trained meteorologist and policy expert who's worked extensively on renewable energy development, building decarbonization and environmental justice at a national level. And finally, Dan Garino, an award-winning reporter at Inside Climate News, where he covers the business and politics of clean energy. Dan has a sharp eye for connecting the dots between policy decisions in Washington and their real-world impacts. We're going to break down exactly what's in the bill, who wins, who loses, and what it means for the U.S. clean energy transition and for the planet. Anyone watching, feel free to chime in, ask questions, engage with us in the chat. We're streaming on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitch. All right, let's set the table here. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act now, despite a nice sounding name, is essentially a major shift away from the clean energy momentum that we'd seen over the last several years. At its core, it rolls back a number of federal incentives for renewable energy like wind and solar instead directs more subsidies and regulatory flexibility towards oil, gas, and coal. It loosens some environmental protections, which means companies will have an easier time building or expanding fossil fuel projects, even if that increases pollution. So it also scales back things like clean energy grants, environmental justice initiatives that were designed to help vulnerable communities to adapt to climate impacts. In plain English, it takes the foot off the gas pedal for clean energy and puts it back on the gas pedal for fossil fuels. Did I miss anything, Gernot?
That summarizes it pretty well. And I think what you missed is the good luck part at the end on pushing fossil fuels in an environment where, frankly, the world is moving in the other direction fast. So yeah, if Trump thought he could revive coal last time around in 2016 and failed miserably, it's even tougher this time around.
Well, one thing I was struck by, it was an article in Bloomberg today, and it was saying that 2,500 wind and solar projects are at risk because of what Trump is doing. In addition to the language in the big, beautiful bill, he's taken executive action to make it even harder to get these wind and solar projects off the ground. And these 2,500 projects have the energy equivalent of 383 nuclear reactors. So, I mean, that's a lot of power that we need. And electricity bills are going up, from what I understand. So this is not going to help his constituents or anybody. Dan, what's your thought on this, given that it affects your home state of Iowa and you've investigated this and written about this? What are your thoughts?
You look at where wind energy is, where it is the most common, and it's this band of states, goes from North Dakota and Minnesota in the north all the way down to Texas. It's where I grew up, and it's places where wind energy has been an essential part of supporting the power grid, not only in those regions, but also shipping power to other parts of the country. I've been doing this long enough. I remember when wind energy was bipartisan. Actually, it wasn't that long ago. But the danger in making wind development in particular, and it also applies to solar development, although the specifics of the markets there are different in some ways. This hurts Republican states. It hurts rural Republican counties, and I think that you can, as an elected official, have policies that hurt some of your constituents, but eventually, if I'm a county government, if I'm a property taxpayer, if I'm a landowner in one of these places, at some point, difficulty developing projects on land you own is a problem, and there is a real concern. Now, some of the talk about how much capacity and its equivalent in other kinds of power plants, it's like that gets to be challenging because it's really tough to say how much of that capacity would actually get built. But I think we can safely say we're talking about a lot of capacity.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of granular effect on individual farmers, I looked it up and it said that an average farmer receives $8,000 to $35,000 in revenue from these wind turbines on their land. So this is real money. This is every year. So you're talking about 10 years, up to 35,000. That's $350,000 in revenue that a farmer would be losing. And then also the tax base that Iowa counties receive tons of money from this wind development that is not going to be there. And the state of Utah, the senator from Utah, John Curtis, joined Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa in kind of holding up Trump nominations to stop this. What are your thoughts, and what do you think the likelihood of Grassley and Curtis kind of winning on this front or negotiating something that's, halfway reasonable?
It's kind of like this attempt to do it without anyone really noticing. I mean, this is the world in which we live, where if these kind of Midwestern Republicans who would like to have some more flexibility in terms of wind energy, if they can actually get what they want, they kind of need to do it without the proponents of the one big beautiful bill realizing it, without the administration realizing it. If it can be some sort of quiet thing, then it has a much greater chance. And that quiet thing is just flexibility in terms of the safe harbor period for these tax credits, and in terms of just kind of the fine print stuff. And I think a lot of the people who are backing these policies are not necessarily fine print kind of guys, so if it's but it is, I don't know how it's going to go. It's you get into kind of how it works in the rulemaking process, how these agencies are going to treat this. And I wonder if this is the point where, and it's not just Grassley and Curtis, you look at, if you're a senator in Kansas, if you're a senator in the Dakotas, if you're a senator in Texas, this matters. This is a lot of economic activity. So yeah, it'll be fascinating. And I think if the wind industry and its supporters are successful, you will probably hear very little about it, because I think part of that success is just kind of having it fly under the radar.
So Lucero, what's your take on this from kind of the place that you sit in environmental justice? How is this big, beautiful bill kind of playing out, and what are some of the negative impacts that you're expecting to see?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Just piggybacking off of Dan, because I think it was insinuated there is in the economic activity is this is jobs, right? Not just revenue, but these are jobs that we're losing out now because projects are being canceled, and then potentially might be canceled with the new restrictions and rollbacks and repeals from the One Big Beautiful Bill. Oftentimes these are union jobs, great high quality, high paying jobs that are not going to be realized because of all the things that the Trump administration and of course the impacts from the One Big Beautiful Bill are doing. From the environmental standpoint, from the One Big Beautiful Bill, we haven't even mentioned, and we won't get into, the impacts that come from big cuts to basic needs programs like Medicaid. About $1 trillion, I think, over the next decade is going to be slashed from Medicaid, leaving approximately 50 million people losing, affordable health care and insurance coverage and things like that. You also have cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. These are some of the largest cuts to SNAP in history, putting about 3 million people at risk of losing some SNAP benefits. These are parents with children, older workers, veterans, those experiencing homelessness, and youth aging out of foster care. And so you have these underlying impacts from the One Big Beautiful Bill due to, these cuts from all these basic needs programs going to fund tax breaks that primarily benefit the ultra wealthy, fossil fuels, et cetera. So you have all these underlying things. Now let's add about those environmental provisions in this bill, right? You already mentioned them, Matt. We are talking about including rolling back and repealing clean energy tax credits that are meant to help get more clean energy online, specifically for solar and wind projects here too. Tax credits that help Americans who, want to switch over to use a cleaner vehicle for themselves, like an electric vehicle, or to install rooftop solar on their homes. And then also funding for climate and clean energy programs that are meant to clean our environment, get more clean energy online, and to make us a lot more environmentally resilient. And so when you bring in these impacts from the environmental provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill, you get pretty much a rapid elimination of solar and wind incentives, right, from these projects. To add context, the energy sector is such a large source of domestic greenhouse gas emissions. I think about 60% of electricity comes from fossil fuels, and that number comes from 2022. So you were going to add a lot more clean energy to the grid, right, to help, offset some of this that, leads to climate change and these climate change impacts, rising sea levels, more intense hurricanes, things like that. That, that's reduced, that's slowing down because of what's in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so now we're going to get like about 600 gigawatts less of clean energy added to the grid over the next year, which then results in a emissions increase, greenhouse gas emissions increase of, I believe, about almost 600 million metric tons over the next decade. That still doesn't help us meet our Paris Agreement goals, our nationally determined contributions, for example. So what that means is we're going to be a lot less, climate change is happening. We're not tackling meeting the moment as much as we need to. We're getting more vulnerable to hurricanes, wildfires, et cetera. And then that also repealed the funding for a bunch of climate resilience programs, and some fundings in improvements for research at NOAA, for modeling, forecasting, assessments, things like that. So you have the climate angle there. You also have a lot of the programs within the Inflation Reduction Act were for environmental, justice reasons. They were a bunch of investments in typically historically left behind communities that are vulnerable, communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. And now we're seeing, I think about 2 weeks ago, Administrator Zeldin said that, we're going to stop with the Solar for All program, which is, I think, $7 billion worth of an investment to, help historically left behind communities, to promote energy independence, lower energy costs, reduce pollution in these communities. And that is being taken away. So what you see is, greater climate impacts, you see greater costs, you see more pollution rising, and just overall a lot of not great environmental impacts because of this bill.
Well, that really covers the waterfront, Lucero.
I just went for it.
Well, I think it's important because it does list out just a tremendous amount of harms that are likely to result from this bill. Gernot, I kind of like to pivot to you and say, well, just from a hard-headed economic perspective, what are the losses, even if you take, climate change and put it on the back burner and say, oh, let's not even look at that. What are the losses to consumers from taking away potentially 2,500 different wind and solar projects, just for instance, and throw in any other aspects you'd like, but particularly as like related to the AI industry that we're trying to power. And this is going to put a roadblock in the way of us kind of leading the charge on this, or certainly as efficiently and effectively as we might like to.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, let me start with saying that when you say economic impact, right, climate risk is financial risk.
Yeah.
Climate risk does cause direct economic harm, not just in the distant future, right, today. So of course, right, none of this is good news. Okay, on the other hand, right, it's always difficult to to say that. On the other hand, so let me try to squeeze out ever so slightly, sort of good news out of the whole morass, which is to say, what has happened, not for solar and wind, not for electric vehicles, not for US manufacturing, which, by the way, gets most hurt by all of this, right? The big winner is China. The big loser is US manufacturing. What we now have, ironically, is bipartisan consensus for some, not all, some low carbon technologies, right? So the IRA was a solely Democratic bill. The OBBBA is a solely Republican, and now both parties, with large majorities within the respective party, have basically said that, for example, geothermal, and yes, nuclear power too, deserve the kind of subsidies that the IRA had provided and the OBBBA now enshrines. Now, again, not good news overall. Right? Geothermal and nuclear, however important they may or may not be to the low carbon future, are not anywhere close to the positive impact of solar, wind, batteries, and so on. But still, right now, that's not exactly a question you asked, because the direct economic impact is very much negative. Certain clean energy investments are now taking off as a result of the passage of OBBBA. And, that's lemon's lemonade, of course. On the other hand, there are certain investments that now look a lot better than they did before, just due to the IRA.
Now,
And,
does solar and wind win, even with the kind of hurdles that Trump is throwing in front of them? Can many of these projects still be built? Because we've been talking about solar and wind being the cheapest forms of power. Can they get around all the roadblocks Trump is throwing up?
So, in part, right? So, okay, so let me try this in 3 parts. So, economics 101, this is bad news, right? So, price up, demand down. That's the one law we have in economics. And yeah, if you increase the cost of solar PV, less solar PV will be built. Economics 102 is about the trajectories, the learning by doing, right? That you add some more complicating factors to things. And honestly, the trajectories all point in the right direction, right? So there's not much Trump can do. Or put differently, yeah, solar PV just got ever so slightly more expensive to build in this country. Okay, what, add 30% to the cost of solar? Now we are back to where solar was in 2022, right? It's gotten so cheap so quickly that making it more expensive today, doubling the cost of solar would mean we set ourselves back by 5 years when solar PV was already the cheapest source of electricity, right? Now, not good news, but not much Trump can do, which is the third part, which is, I know this is hard to sort of look at the positives here, but the fact that it is necessary to throw all these other wrenches in the way, right? The fact that it's necessary for the Secretary of the Interior to come out and say things like, wind turbines built near rail lines will somehow muck with the communication on our trains, and therefore we can't build wind turbines, right? Like sort of insanities like that is a good sign, right? I mean, good. It's horrible, but it's a good sign in the sense that, look, they've got to go down those rabbit holes to throw these additional wrenches in the way and roadblocks for solar, wind, batteries, because economically they would win on their own. So, if you want to hand some money to your buddies in the oil industry, that's basically the only way to do it these days. You basically have to declare wind turbines to, turn whales batty, and therefore we can't build offshore wind, because otherwise we just would.
So, Dan, where does this break down? I mean, obviously it's a tough question in terms of the political coalition that elected Trump and the Republicans. You can only kind of anger so many of your constituencies before you start to lose. And if he takes away, wind revenues that goes to farmers, he increases power costs to people across the spectrum, and throws down all kinds of hurdles in the way of manufacturers, doesn't that begin to erode his coalition? And isn't it likely that in 2026, the Republicans lose in a landslide the House of Representatives?
Some of the things to pay attention to are inflation and especially inflation of utility bills. Utility bills are one of those things that people really notice. Like if your electric bill goes from being kind of going from hurting to feeling like it pretty much just killed your income for that month, there's a gap there that is important, where people are thinking about their utility bills and they're thinking about actively using less electricity because utility bills have become so onerous. And a lot of the things in this bill are going to be inflationary for power, for wholesale power, and for and you look at what was already happening, which is power prices were going up anyway for a whole bunch of different reasons. So, President Trump talked about reducing power prices, making energy less expensive, and this energy abundance agenda. Yet this bill puts up all of these challenges for certain types of energy. And it increases our reliance on some of the most volatile energy sources in terms of cost. So in terms of what could affect the 2026 election, I think if you have large swaths of people, regardless of the voting history of a state, who are upset about really high electric bills, really high gas bills, and then just inflation in general, because this is part of a larger picture with tariffs and with other things. Tariffs are contributing to higher energy costs as well. But if groceries get more expensive, and they are, these are the kind of things that really hurt, especially if a core part of your message was that you could handle the economy more effectively. So yeah, that's and marginal house seats.
One more thing, which is insurance premiums that are going up because of all these natural disasters. I think they're going up even faster than utility bills and groceries. They're like insane. They're like a hockey puck curve.
And it's just the costs. If you look at the typical bills, just how much money do you have left at the end of the month to do fun stuff? If that's going down a lot, and you can, with the insurance bills, it gets a little bit harder to directly attribute that to policy. I don't know people necessarily, other than us and people who closely watch this stuff. But yeah, it's a real kind of pocketbook issues are where a lot of the 26 election in marginal House seats could be about. Do people feel economically stressed?
Lucera, do you see that in the work that you're doing as far as the insurance premiums? People complaining about that? Do you think that's going to be an issue? And I guess maybe how to connect the dots so that people see it as an issue. Certainly, people in Florida who've gotten hammered by hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, and many of their properties are just like uninsurable. I can't imagine why they could still vote for an administration that just closes their eyes to the risks that
Right.
we created.
Right. And I think a couple of years ago, the climate change was one of the, if not the number one indicator of where you're politically affiliated. And I think it was in February, if I'm misremembering, I apologize, but I think I read a study in February where that's specifically not becoming the case anymore in Florida, because they are getting impacted by, recent hurricanes, the ones that just totally have devastated many communities in Florida and has taken time to rebuild, and they're facing these impacts, these economic impacts, loss of jobs because they can't get to work, there things like that. So that is certainly becoming the case. I do think affordability will be a top issue in the coming elections. What else would be on the forefront of Americans when they go to the polls, I think is something that we are very much interested in, and trying to make sure that we get it right, because I think something like climate change, something like, environmental, anything related to, the environment, I think we can very much put it in whatever issue frame that, the voters do want to know. Affordability, is affordability your main concern? You got it. Those insurance prices are going up. Your my car insurance prices, I lived in the state of Texas for a while, it went up substantially the last couple of years because of hail, the risk of hail. And I can't, you have to pay at some locations a lot more money because of the hail risks during certain times of months in the year. That, rebuilding homes, things like that, we totally can frame it in that way. If public health, if health is your number one issue, again, we have ways to be able to match that, and it's just going to be absolutely crucial for folks to really talk to, the voters, the people in power, to see what's most important for them, and make an issue like climate change so salient to them moving
Well, I guess
forward.
that's the question. In terms of health, I don't see that the environmental movement has made a really good
Hmm.
argument on that front in, certainly in the last election cycle.
Yeah.
Um, I think it did in the initial environmental, flourishing in the early 70s. People could see Love Canal, or they could see
Right.
these environmental disasters. They could see, Los Angeles, where you couldn't breathe, and people acted, and Congress acted. Why? How do we connect the dots for people to see that this really causes problems for people in real life, and from a health perspective? Because I
I
think that
mean,
that's a visceral reaction. When people do connect it, I think they would vote for their health.
yeah, I agree, and and I agree with your point that it's something that we need to make a lot more salient. This administration, they're doing a lot of things that, a lot of rollbacks specifically, that do endanger public health. We have these um, permissions, if you will, for coal plants to, not meet certain standards in pollution, get these exemptions, to apply for exemptions. And many, I think 40, 50, somewhere in that number, some, power plant companies have gotten exemptions. Coal plants for 20 years, there's a statistic that from 20 years, uh, coal plants were directly associated with 460,000 deaths in the United States. That's a lot of loss of life because of the association with the burning of coal and its associated pollutants there too. And that's just not the one example. That's just one example of what this administration is doing right now. That, coal is one of the worst pollutants for climate. Once you burn it, it's one of the worst emitters of greenhouse gases that, obviously contribute to climate change. So that's just one example of what this administration is doing, and there's going to be a lot more examples in the coming years, in the coming months, that, we can really hold this administration, anyone responsible and accountable for what they're doing and for the impacts, and try to make those impacts as realistic and hard home hitting for Americans as possible.
Well, Gernot, tell us from an economic perspective, the public health costs to the extent you can, and obviously it's a huge topic, but so what are some of the public health costs that you see coming out of this, the big, beautiful bill and what it's likely to result in and how it can be salably communicated to people to say, hey, this is a real risk and this is a real problem?
So ironically, right, so many of the climate legislations, regulations we've had in the past, the real benefits to society is via public health, right? So yeah, there are climate costs. The social cost of carbon is enormous. It is a real problem, of course, to ignore the carbon externality. But the much more immediate, much larger in many ways, positive health effects of less PM 2.5 pollution, right? Less soot, less local air pollution are much, much larger typically than the climate benefits. So in other words, now with OBBBA, the very direct immediate costs of us again pumping money into oil and gas and so on are all via public health. So yes, right, kids' asthma rates are going up if you burn more gas in your kitchen with your gas stove. What is it, 15% or so of asthma cases in kids can be linked to the stove in your kitchen, right? We know the solution. we do, right? Switching from gas to induction does not provide that much benefit in terms of climate, right? You don't burn that much gas in your kitchen, turns out. Now, of course, it's a necessary step to cut the gas line to the house.
Let me just say that, that's a great point, Gernot, and it's not one that I have read in all the stuff that I've been reading. Now, maybe I'm just not reading enough, but like that isn't being communicated, and the Republicans are winning on that issue. Like, oh, they're trying to take your stove away. Well, your kids are less likely to have asthma because of it. Isn't that, do you care about your kids? Like, isn't that a thing too? Like,
there's that, right? And by the way, right, so it used to be essentially, oh my God, it's going to be so expensive to replace your gas stove, right? It used to be that the cheapest possible way to boil your water was the contractor grade gas stove, right? $300 or whatever these things cost. By now, the induction plate at IKEA is $50, right? Like the cheapest way is in fact the cleanest, safest. Communicating that is crucial.
So in terms of broad economic costs, and you pointed to it, I read that when George H.W. Bush was president, enacted Clean Air Act #2 in, 90 or 91, that from that, something like 200,000 deaths a year were avoided because of us cleaning up our air. That's 2 million deaths in a decade. So why aren't we communicating that more effectively, that this is the type of reduction that is possible if we clean up our air?
Of course. And by the way, in economic terms, right? I mean, deaths are tragic, of course, right? So, okay, as an economist, guilty as charged, right? We do this in dollars. Turns out the benefits of the Clean Air Act and Clean Act amendments, the George H.W. Bush ones from 1990, dwarf the costs to the tune of like 30 to 1, 40 to 1, right? For every dollar invested, we get $30 back, $40 back. And maybe to go even one further, and this is the reason, by the way, why economists are typically not invited to dinner parties, right? Because you're talking about deaths, and then I'm saying, by the way, have you thought about your pocketbook, right? So it turns out GDP today, okay, year 2020 is the study I have in the back of my mind now. The gross domestic product, economic activity was higher because of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 than GDP would have been without it, right? Why? How? Well, if you knock out fewer IQ points in kids in the 1990s, they turn into more productive workers later on, and therefore GDP goes up, right? That's not the reason why we should be, protecting our kids and not knocking out IQ points, right? With pollution. It's not the only reason, but it turns out even that narrow-minded, solely economic analysis just focused on worker productivity alone works in favor of those clean air measures. And well, that's the reason why we are not invited to dinner parties, right? Because it's all in dollars. On the other hand, even there, the math works.
Well, I think that in part we have to win the battle of dollars and cents as well as hearts and minds. And that is the fortunate thing, as you alluded to earlier, is that the technology of wind and solar does win on dollars and cents. And I think the elephant in the room is that Trump wants to kill clean energy because he sees it as an opponent to his ideas, his constituencies, in terms of political power. And he sees clean energy and clean power as associated with the Democratic Party, and so he wants to kill it. Is that wrong, Dan, or am I being delusional?
Well, I think it's almost a little narrower than that in terms of, so wind and solar and batteries, they make fossil fuel power less profitable. They affect energy markets in ways where the days where a fossil fuel power plant owner is going to make the most money, and the way, especially like a natural gas peaker plant, they make most of their money on just a couple days a year. So the rapid growth of wind and solar, it's not even a question as much of market share and things like that. It's that you are taking the very most lucrative days, the days that a oil and gas company, it's like, makes their year. And you are creating this more competitive grid where it's just less necessary to use the most inefficient and the most expensive power sources. So it's about, there's a lot of this is about profit margins and about profit and about, you look at some of the people who were supporting this campaign, they're people who are directly tied to, they're companies that are on the winning end whenever we have an excruciatingly hot day in which every single one of those gas peaker plants is going full out. And if you add a ton of wind and solar, there's less need for that. If you have batteries that can replicate some of that, there's less need for that.
Yeah, it seems like Trump hates the battery companies too, because the battery companies have made wind and solar even more viable because they can store the power during the cloudy days and during the evening. So, he's after them too, because they're an evil.
Very quickly on this. So yeah, Matt, you're in California, right? So California, like 4 years or so ago, there was already plenty of solar PV in the system. And to Dan's point, when was it most profitable to run the gas plants? Well, it was when the sun went down on a daily basis and Californians went home, right? Well, electricity demand went up and suddenly these gas plants were pumping at full power. In just 3 years, so this is data from last year, actually. So in just 3 years, batteries are now accounting for half of that peak in the evening hours on a daily basis. And then, right, there's the annual cycles were on a hot August afternoon when you're a gas utility and you're really making money. And newsflash, utilities hate that, right? Gas utilities hate that fact. So yeah, I'm completely with Dan on this one. And I think all of us would agree, of course, that this is about profit margins of fossil fuel utilities. They are among the most profitable companies on the planet, fossil fuel companies more broadly. And they will do everything in their power to argue against this low carbon transition.
Well, I heard that the Coke industries had like $1 trillion of fossil fuels trapped in the ground. And so naturally they have an incentive to back an administration that allows them to burn that $1 trillion worth of investment. They'd hate to have that captured in the ground and not be able to make money off of it. So they're going to do everything in their power to back this. Lucero, what do you see kind of in poor communities as far as struggling to make ends meet. I had a guest on the program recently that was backing solar, balcony solar, and it seemed like in Germany that's really taken off, and in Pakistan it's taken off, and unfortunately it's kind of unable to pass all the regulatory hurdles here in the U.S., even though it seems like a pretty simple technology. Is that something that you've been following, or things like that that would help poorer communities?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different things that got rolled back with the One Big Beautiful Bill that were specifically supposed to target low-income communities. We've mentioned those programs and grants that, installed, solar in communities, or there was even one program that got rolled back that would do air monitoring in schools, specifically in low-income communities as well. So we see a lot of these rollbacks, again, rollbacks that help homeowners to upgrade to rooftop solar, to upgrade, to energy efficient appliances, to do installation in their homes. Those are also going back, and all of this is energy efficient to try to help reduce costs, those electrical costs and things like that. So I think there is going to be, I think there is limited right now support from the federal government to vulnerable communities that, help and support them and move them forward in the ways that they need to do. And a lot of this disinvestment goes against, the types of investments and programs and things like that that the federal government should be doing for low-income communities that are vulnerable, those types of communities.
So what do you see as a solution to that, and how can those problems be addressed by state and local governments to help those communities and make them more resilient, and make them kind of get off fossil fuels?
Yeah, I mean, I think states and local governments have some challenges ahead of them. And I really do hope that they prioritize these types of investments, adaptation programs, and projects. But just with the One Big Beautiful Bill alone, you have the Medicaid cuts, and you have SNAP cuts, and the SALT state and local tax deduction cap increasing, that will ultimately like reduce states' incomes, but then or states' revenues, but then also make more out-of-pocket expenses for states. At the same time, there's cuts to education generally, things like that. So I hear a lot of states' budgets are in deficits, and they're struggling. So I think some states will have some challenges ahead of them, but I think it's important that people continue to advocate for their needs, and mobilize, and make sure that their voices are heard, especially up in the coming elections.
Well, tell us, you have a background in meteorology, and all the cuts to NOAA and the like, as far as studying weather, and what are the likely impacts of this, and can private entities take over that function easily, or is this going to be a problem for the country? I mean, we've already seen some instances of bad weather, not maybe having as many meteorologists or the like on the ground to do the work to prepare for these events.
Yeah, I mean, so far I haven't seen any reports on false or inaccurate forecasting. The latest one that I think I saw a lot of misinformation was the Texas flooding. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service really did what they needed to do. The coordination of how to get that information out, making sure people were safe. That part, I believe, is where there were a lot of missing variables and things that should have been improved there. But I think with the cuts that they're doing, they're still doing what they need to do, specifically the National Weather Service. But there is concern that there might be an instance in the next coming months, the next year or so, that results in inaccurate forecasting. Private companies rely a lot on the modeling, the information, the data that NOAA generally and the National Weather Service captures. We're talking about putting up weather balloons, right? I think National Weather Service in each location, they send up 2 weather balloons a day, and then this helps tell meteorologists what's going on in the atmosphere, what's the pressure, all throughout the different levels of the atmosphere. You have, I think, almost 1,000 temperature pressure collection stations at the surface level throughout the country. You have satellites that you get just a bigger picture of what's going on over in the entire world, things like that. The resources that the government, specifically NOAA, that pulls together to be able to inform these accurate weather forecasts is something that the private industry cannot replicate at this point in time, and would be super costly for them to try to even do so. And so private companies rely on the data from the National Weather Service, which is why it's super important to continue to fund to not only maintain and upkeep these systems, but to also improve them, to make sure that our research gets better and better, that our forecasts can get better and better, because there's everyone says, meteorologists are not right, but we try to be. we really do try to be. And there's still ways that, we can predict, there's still things that we can still do a lot better. Maybe we can one day say like, oh, a tornado is going to hit exactly X, Y, and Z, and we have, a good amount of lead time. But on that micro scale, tornadoes are so small compared to like hurricanes, and it's just so much harder to predict like a tornado versus a hurricane. So all that to say is that we should be funding NOAA. We should be funding the National Weather Service, because there's a reason why NOAA is under the Department of Commerce, is because the U.S. government recognizes that, weather does impact American livelihood and property and its economy. And that makes total sense. So we should continue to provide that vital service for not just our economy, but literally for the lives of American people.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Dan. The bill mentions energy emergency. What do you think about the framing of this as a crisis, especially when you consider the growing body of evidence on economic, environmental impacts of climate change?
So the framing of this as an emergency, especially kind of within the legal language of what constitutes an emergency, is pretty dubious. We are. I mean, it's almost hard to even decide where to start unpacking that, because there's just so many issues with that. The United States is already the leading oil producer in the world. The United States is already this idea of declaring an emergency and saying that the solution to the emergency is to take things that you're already, by a healthy clip, number one at, and do them even more, kind of regardless of what the markets are asking for, it kind of strains credibility. There also is this simultaneous attempt to undermine demand side solutions. So that just means conservation, figuring out ways to use less energy. A good way to deal with an energy emergency, if there was one, if there is a problem with not having enough energy, is to find ways to use less of it. And we know of a whole bunch of ways that are grossly underutilized. And the Inflation Reduction Act was among many other things, gave support to addressing some of those demand side issues. So it's like,
And didn't Trump kind of famously attack energy efficiency? I mean, in terms of, hey, why do we need more
consumer choice?
Yeah, why do we want light bulbs that are actually work with less energy? Why do we care about showers that have less water? Sorry to interrupt you, but
Well, these are the kind of things, like the light bulb thing is just, it's like, it's almost a curse to cover the stuff and to be familiar with some of the energy implications of lighting, because you hear some of the talk about light bulbs and it just kind of makes your mind explode. It's just kind of like, it's like the potential. And we've seen so much benefit from going to more efficient lighting in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, it's just gigantic, the environmental benefit of more efficient lighting. And a lot of this kind of fondness for older lighting technologies is just a matter of habit. It's not really, but yeah, it's this idea of declaring an emergency while at the same time you're hamstringing things that would actually address the problem is just, it's a real challenge to kind of try to make sense of it within any sort of logical framework.
Well, Gernot, from the economic perspective, efficiency seems to make a lot of sense. Of course, you get a lot of pushback from Trump and a lot of Republicans about, say, vehicles meeting a miles per gallon standard, which saved billions of gallons of fuel. Now, kind of turning back the clock on that. What do you think efficiency could do for us, and what will be the cost of being more inefficient?
I mean, just to be clear, efficiency in economic terms is productivity. It is doing more with less. So inefficiency is bad in lots of ways. And to go back to Dan's point about light bulbs, to be clear, the light bulb efficiency standards we have in place now, which by the way are no longer necessary now, but that led to the phase out of incandescent light bulbs and the LEDs now, were signed into law by the well-known lefty George W. Bush. It was the Energy Independence Act of 2007 that gave us those. And yeah, back then, right, we had the Light Bulb Freedom Act of 2009 or something, introduced by Michelle Bachmann, Tea Party. And that was insanity back then. And of course, what we have seen is that by now, actually, Trump won 2016. He tried to remove some of these standards, and he did. He did it hand-handedly, so he lost in the courts. But at the time, when those standards disappeared temporarily, the GEs of the world, the Panasonics of the world, and so on, basically said, we don't want to sell those inefficient light bulbs anymore. We too like LEDs, and Walmart didn't stock them, and the rest is history. There are just better ways to light our homes than the inefficient incandescent bulbs that are no longer being sold. And it's that sort of example where, back to Dan, right, makes your head explode when you know a little bit about this. It's just crazy to think that this is the sort of example that we turn into a culture war at the end of the day. Because in purely economic terms, efficiency is good. Why wouldn't you look at the newer, better, cheaper technology as something that is desirable for all the obvious reasons, as opposed to turning things like light bulbs or gas stoves or internal combustion engines? Right? Remember Sarah Palin? I like the smell of pollution. I don't.
Yeah, when I go travel to other countries that don't have like catalytic converters, I guess, or whatever, because the smog there is just so thick, you can just taste it in your mouth and in your throat. You're like, well, thank God we have some pollution control devices in the US that make our lives more tolerable. And, I guess I was going to ask Lucera, what role do you see public mobilization and political engagement playing in pushing back against the provisions of this bill and advocating for stronger climate action?
Yeah, no, it's a huge role. I just want to highlight one particular fight during the One Big Beautiful Bill when it was going through, or so-called, but when it was going through Congress, particularly throughout the life of the One Big Beautiful Bill reconciliation process in Congress, there were proposals and language requiring the sell-off of millions of acres of public lands. They were different variations of this effort from congressional Republicans to really try to make this language stick in the final version. But I want to highlight there was a lot of public mobilization against it. You have grassroots organizations, you have environmental nonprofits, you have hunters, you have hikers. The public really rallied together to make their voices heard, to call all their representatives, to ultimately, organize together and put pressure on congressional Republicans to just not to vote for this. And ultimately, there were no direct public land sell-offs that were included in the final bill. I do want to say that, they did manage to include like other terrible provisions that do, in fact, open up our public lands for oil and gas leasing and drilling. But, it was our public lands that, would be in a much, much more place if we didn't have that bipartisan support, that community mobilization that we really saw in those last couple of weeks of this fight. So I just want to state that power does in fact lie with the people. Climate and extreme weather impacts us all. It's important to recognize who is trying to fight for stronger climate action, to protect, our wallets, our health, our families and communities, and to also recognize who's not doing that and rather would prioritize, the profits for fossil fuel companies over American families. So it is absolutely important to stay informed, to stay active, and to mobilize when you see something that will negatively impact your communities and states, much like a lot of the provisions that we saw from the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Do you see any opportunities for action? Kind of what's on the immediate horizon that you see that people should be turning their attention to and calling their representatives about?
Yeah, I mean, the big one that I'm working on this week is EPA has announced its intention to roll back the endangerment finding. The endangerment finding is, what holds the EPA responsible under the Clean Air Act to curb greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide and methane from sources like vehicles and power plants, because they do in fact endanger public health and the welfare from Americans. So they're in the middle of, I think hearings start next week, but I think you can submit comments until maybe the 1st of September, something like that. But that's the first step, is making sure your voice is heard, that this fundamental climate ruling that holds the EPA responsible to regulate these greenhouse gases, that's at stake here, and this is the first and most immediate thing that's, I feel like, is on my mind.
So what can listeners do? Where would they go? Who should they talk to? And what are the chances of getting the ear of the Trump EPA?
I hope that they're finding on what they're basing their ruling off is a DOE report that came out a couple of weeks ago that is written by climate skepticists, and that report is like obviously like false, not based in science, things like that. And so I'm hoping that lawyers and people can band together. Right now, you can submit comments. You can let your representative know that this is not something that you want to see, and things like that. And hopefully, in some way, we can make sure that this does not get rolled back.
Gernot, I'll let you have the last word on this endangerment finding, and what are the economic arguments against this, and what do you think is the best argument for attacking this?
I think Lucero just said most of it. I mean, this is one of these nutty efforts where actually, take a step back. Essentially, what it's trying to do is say that CO2 does not endanger public health, which of course is completely wrong, ignores fundamental science, fundamental economics. And just to give you one sense of this DOE report in the background that is supposedly supporting this, I took this 150-page document and ran it through the same system, Turnitin, that we use to check whether student submissions
No, you didn't. Oh my gosh.
plagiarized. Let me just say, without alleging anything here, that that would be automatically reported to the dean, who would then take appropriate steps. It's sort of crazy how we pretend that this is sort of real science. I mean, it turns out most of us don't even pretend, of course, because it is not. It is written by 6 climate contrarians, and that's the nice term here, who then quote themselves from sort of 2018. And when I say quote, I am in fact referring to something that gets flagged by a system like Turnitin, where, you have half a dozen people recycling stuff from a decade ago and pretending that that in some sense supports the science. It does not.
Well, I mean, the climate consensus is, and I mean, this goes back to the oil companies even agree that climate change is happening and that they are, that fossil fuels are causing and exacerbating it. The petrostates agree with this. And yet, the Trump administration is not agreeing with it. I mean, like, you're further out on the limb than Saudi Arabia. And
the CEO of Exxon, the finance minister of Saudi Arabia, are both basically, further left here than the Trump administration. Yes, it's crazy.
The insanity goes on. Well, thank you so much, Lucero and Gernot and Dan, for being on the program. And we appreciate the lively discussion, and we hope that all of you listeners found this valuable, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, tap the notification button so you don't miss our next live broadcast, and share the episode with friends and family. You can also follow Climate Change with Matt Matern on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So leave us a review. It really helps us reach more people. And remember, every time you follow us on Apple or Spotify, we'll plant a tree in the Amazon rainforest. So let's keep growing the community and a forest. I'm Matt Matern, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.